Modern applications are no longer these clunky monoliths that we used to build. Instead, they're comprised of all of these different building blocks, different services, different microsystems, and this distributed architecture. Now, it's APIs, application program interfaces, that connect all these building blocks. So, securing our APIs is, in fact, securing our applications. But what exactly does API security entail, and how can we secure all of our API endpoints? It is these questions about API security that we ask our special guest in today's episode with Dan Barahona. Now, Dan is a 20-year cybersecurity veteran and has held many exec positions in different companies, including Qualys, ArcSight, Unveiled, APISec, and he is even the founder of APISec University, which he started in 2022 to offer free non-vendor training on API security. The site has grown to over 50,000 students in its first 6 months, which is absolutely incredible. And I can't wait to dive into this conversation with Dan Barahona.
Security. So I had the pleasure of seeing you speak at API World 2023,
Right on.
uh, and really enjoyed your talk. And I walked away with several impressions. But the name of the talk, hacking your own API, it's kind of like set me on this rabbit hole. Like, yeah, why aren't we attacking our own APIs? But let's back up a little bit higher level there. So API security is specifically what you're focused on at API Sec. Um, what is the difference between traditional, what we think of as tech security or code security, information technology security, and what makes API security special and different?
Yeah, what's interesting about API security is APIs are kind of our gateway to all kinds of back-end functionality. It's how we plug things together. It's how we enable integrations across companies and even within companies, right? And APIs largely power all of our UIs and mobile apps and things like that. And what's different here is APIs don't just expose the functionality you want to expose. It also exposes all the warts and vulnerabilities and anything else that might exist in your backend logic, in your backend applications. And hackers and attackers have gotten hip to that, right? They've recognized that if you can find a flaw in an API, you can go straight to exploit, right? And we've been using our front ends as kind of a gateway to prevent that kind of abuse from happening, right? So our UIs control what I can see, what buttons I can press, what functionalities I can execute. And attackers are like, all right, that's great, but if I just go right around the UI and start interfacing with the API directly, all those controls kind of disappear. And a lot of times those APIs have a lot more permissions, a lot more access, a lot more functionality than they really ought to. And I think it's almost like a perception shift that's necessary, which is, the UI is not the the single interface to all of our functionality and all our capability and all our data. The APIs are too, and we've kind of ignored that or missed that fact, and we've got breach after breach example where that's being exploited.
Yeah, I was hoping you could actually not tell all the examples you gave, but the one that stuck out to me that scared me the most, to be honest with you, was the Coinbase one. Can you
Sure.
just run us through a quick high level, like what happened there?
Yeah, Coinbase is a great example, and I just want to point out always that I think Coinbase did a fabulous job of reacting and responding to this, and it just really shows how clever or how difficult these attacks can be to prevent and to mitigate. So at Coinbase, this researcher wanted to play around with the Coinbase platform and find any potential vulnerabilities or issues. So they set up an account, they started trading, and they started sniffing the traffic to see what was going on behind the UI. They found the APIs that were powering the transactions. Anytime he did a trade, there were four parameters being transmitted. What was he selling? Was he on the buy or sell side? Source account, target account. Every transaction looked like that. And so he actually owned 0.0243 units of Ethereum. And like a good hacker, you want to try different things out, get error messages, see what you can get the back end to expose. And so he ran a query where he changed his Ethereum to Bitcoin and waited for the error message to come back, and didn't get an error message. Instead, he got $43,000 deposited. And what he effectively did was change his asset from pesos to pounds or whatever you want to call it, right? And it actually worked, right? And I think at that point he thought he was going to prison. Went on to Twitter. You can find the tweets where he's looking for the CEO's email and stating that he's found, quote, a market nuking vulnerability, which I think was not hyperbole at all. And Coinbase reacted immediately. They shut down the market. They were able to reproduce it, and they blogged about it about a week or so later. And they said the root cause of the bug was, quote, missing logic validation check. And what that means is the app was checking, did you own 2.0243 units? They just weren't checking of what? Like, was it Ethereum? Was it Bitcoin? Was it something else? And that is, I think a really good example of how logic can be exploited through APIs, right? And why it's, we spend so much time with developers making sure that the app does what it's meant to do. And I think what we're missing is, does it not do what it's not supposed to do, right? Those negative scenarios, right? Like, there's nothing in the PRD probably that said, make sure you can't change Ethereum to Bitcoin. It's just assumed, right? And I think what's really needed is to make sure that the people developing and operating these APIs are aware of the types of ways that these APIs are getting exploited.
That's such a crazy story, and shout out to Coinbase for dealing with that so well. Is there something that's like, perhaps companies that don't deal with things so well? Is there certain vulnerabilities that you see out there in the API world that drive you crazy, that are consistent, kind of causing havoc
Yeah.
in the security perspective?
There is one, right? And what I just described with Coinbase is what you'd call a BOLA vulnerability, broken object level authorization. It's number one on the OWASP top 10 list. And I sort of feel for Coinbases of the world, because those are hard to find, right? And that's why we say you should hack your own API. You should test, you should simulate, you should see if these things can actually work. But the one that drives me crazy is OWASP number 2, which is broken. It's probably related to 1 and 2, broken authentication. The thing that drives me crazy is there are many, many examples of breaches where organizations implemented authentication on their APIs, right? So I got to make sure I'm Dan and I've got proper credentials and all of that, and then I can get access to the API and do the things that I want to do. Okay. And a lot of companies, a lot of organizations think they're done when they've got authentication, right? And they don't take the next step to enforce authorization, right? So the example I used at API World, and there are many, many more, is Peloton, right? So in this case, there was an open API endpoint. This endpoint had access to the entire user database, 4 million users, myself included. And some researcher discovered this, notified Peloton, and after enough sort of, insistence, they went and fixed it, right? And they added authentication to this endpoint. Great. So now you have to authenticate to this endpoint, which doesn't take much effort to go create an account, and you still could access all 4 million users, right? And so there's this perception out there that authentication is enough, right? Or that authentication equals authorization, and that as long as we are authenticating users, we're good, right? But in reality, that's just the beginning of what you need to do. You need to make sure that you're controlling access, not just who can access the API, but what they can see, what data they can access, whose records they have permissions to.
So that leads to a natural question, like, so auth-z is the hard problem, authorization. Like, am I allowed to do this in this circumstance? What are people putting in place? Like, is there a tooling solution? And now, is there a standard people can follow?
Yeah, I think there are companies out there trying to solve this problem, and I'm not savvy enough to really comment on whether it's a a good approach or not. Well, what occurs to me, and what I hear a lot from folks is, while authentication can be enforced at a gateway at the front end, right? There are definitely authentication approaches and tools and technologies. You absolutely should use them. Authorization is really more at the logic layer, right? It's like if you think about the Coinbase example, right? We had a missing logic validation check, right? I'm not sure there's a third party tool out there, and maybe there are, but at the end of the day, like they had to add code into their app that says, not only check the quantity of units, right, but check the asset type, right? And to me, that's why it's so critical to train and educate developers on this topic, because that's probably where the authorization logic needs to live, right? To me, it's not evident how you bolt that on in a runtime or as a sort of an after the fact type of thing. It's so unique to your application logic that feels like that's where the enforcement needs to take.
So in your talk that Dwayne was talking about, you were encouraging people to hack their own APIs. Now, typically the process for when you're trying to attack your own application or your own microservices, you may get a pen tester involved or something like the sites. Developers and even some people in security, don't necessarily have the skill set
Yeah.
to really do a full penetration test or know what to do. So, how is it that people perhaps that aren't super familiar with penetration testing, how should they go about hacking their own APIs, checking their own vulnerabilities?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's the typical way that companies do testing, security testing, is either through like some automation tools like a DAST, or even code analysis and things like that. Those really don't address APIs very well. Right, the legacy tools we got out there, they're not giving you that coverage, and they're looking for sort of low hanging fruit like injections and cross site scripting and poor coding practices, right? But like all those examples that I just shared and what we talked about at API World, that wouldn't have caught any of them, right? Let's be real, right? It's logic flaws, it's authorization. So you really need to like dynamically test or hack your APIs, right? So then you're looking at manual testing. And that looks like, hiring a pen test firm or, red team or that sort of thing to literally hack your APIs and try to test them. But human testing isn't great for APIs either, right? If you ask me, and I'm no expert on this, but if you wanted me to test your web interface, well, at least I can look at it. I can understand what it's trying to do. I could see a form field here. I could see a button there, things I can inject. But if you gave me an API, you'd be like, okay, here's the command line, go to it, right? It's just totally wide open. There's no structure. It's extremely difficult for human testers, right? And if you gave an API to two different pen testers, I bet you would get two completely different sets of tests being run, right? And so it's a really tricky thing, and I think it's why it's there have been so many successful breaches, right? Because we're not doing a great job of testing our APIs. In fact, one of the stats I shared in the talk was, if you look at all the testing that we do on APIs, functional testing is at the top, performance testing is right underneath it. We're doing tons and tons of that, and way down the list was security testing, right? And it's not being done in CI/CD. It's not being done. And so what we're big believers in over here at AppySec University is automated continuous API security testing, right? And there are technologies that exist now that will analyze your API. It will apply all these different attack vectors. It'll look at things like the OWASP and basically generate tailored tests that pressure test your API to look for vulnerabilities, and we'll do it consistently. So, your first API gets tested in similar ways as your second API. And the nice thing is, instead of like a once or twice a year pen test, you can make it continuous, right? You can wire it into your CI/CD. So when I say hack your own APIs, I'm really saying like go look at technologies out there that will do this for you, because really, like hiring teams, you're not going to pen test every release, right? You're probably pushing code every month, every week, every day. That's not going to happen, right? And it's probably not going to test your API comprehensively. So that's what we're really advising companies and encouraging development teams and security teams to do is to like go look at the new technologies and start making that API testing a priority, right? And not just focused on the front end.
Yeah, you said something really interesting, and I think it summed that up very well at API World in that talk, which was we're really busy testing the happy path, getting making sure it does what we think it should do,
Yeah.
but we're not testing for what it's not designed to do. And that sounds pretty much what you're saying is like make sure you're testing for those other
Yeah.
cases. And I'm glad to hear there are tools out there to help with that.
There are tools, and that's right, right. Like the happy path is what we're the business is worried about, right? Is what the product team is being asked to deliver. But this is where I think a problem exists, kind of structurally in a lot of organizations, which is security teams and development teams are often way too disconnected. And when I talk to security teams about APIs, I often get this like deer in the headlights look like we don't even know what APIs we have. What's a Swagger file, right? And there's a real disconnect. And then security or development teams aren't aware of how APIs are getting breached and how they're being exploited and so forth. So if you remember from my like top 10 best practices, one of them, I think number 3 is get security and development collaborating, right? Because security cannot be bolted on, right? You can't, right? There's no firewall that's going to magically protect you from all these things or some gateway. You can't apply it after the fact. It's got to be woven into the DNA of your applications. And dev teams need to understand this stuff, right? So, we talked to a lot of CISOs out there, and some of the best practices that I hear are like embedding security champions into the dev team, right? And creating that interaction, right? Doing lunch and learns. That's actually something I do a lot nowadays, which is just like, set up a time. I'll show up and I'll talk to you all about APIs and security. And there'll be dev people in the room and security, maybe some compliance, right? So, that's the sort of cultural change I think that needs to happen in order to actually see some improvement in our API security.
Oh, sorry. Yep, yep, yep,
And
yep.
that was the last question. No, I really appreciate that top 10 that you did provide there. Um, without having to re-summarize that here, do you have a blog post on that or somewhere we can
Oh,
uh, find that out
I
there
really
already?
ought to. I really ought to have maybe I'll go make one.
All
But
right.
yeah, that's actually a really good idea. I'm sort of like everyone's got a top 10, so I've got Dan's top 10 best practices. So yeah, I think that ought to be it. It's definitely captured in our API security fundamentals course, which is a really great starting point for anyone that wants to learn about API security. And it talks about real world breaches. It talks about the OWASP API top 10. And we do like to give folks kind of tactical, tangible things that they can go back and start to implement. So, yeah, absolutely.
Well, talking about tactical, tangible things, um, you know, obviously education is a pretty big passion for you because you're also the founder of APISec University, which you pretty explicitly say is kind of a vendor-neutral place to look at and dive into security. Can you touch on, well, first of all, what is APISec University and why you thought that was needed to create that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we launched this about just over a year ago. We launched AppySec or APISec University. Me and my buddy Corey Ball, he's here's a little plug. He's the author of Hacking APIs, and we had this crazy idea of why don't we build a course to accompany the book? And we never really expected this site to take off like it has. And the inspiration for creating it is like, there's a clear need, there's a clear gap in knowledge and awareness around how to secure APIs. So we had this crazy idea to go create a site and build this course. And so Corey recorded the course where he actually shows you how to hack APIs, all the tools and techniques and so forth. 12 hours of sort of hands-on instruction. And I built the website and the sort of, workflow and user management and all of that. And it just took off. It absolutely took off. On day one, we had 5,000 people sign up. It was really remarkable. And the success of that suggested that maybe we should continue. We should add more, right? And so we started to hear from a lot of corporations saying, we really need to train our API developers, our product owners, our ops teams on API security risks. But that pen testing course, that's kind of a little too much. Do you have something else that we can offer? And that's what created API Security Fundamentals. I'm the instructor of that. It's 90 minutes. And we cover all these things like real world breaches, the OWASP API top 10, something we call the 3 pillars of API security, which is governance, testing, and monitoring, and so forth, right? And this thing has just kind of kept on growing and growing. We now have partners creating and publishing course. So we have a documentation best practices course taught by Jason Harmon, who's really the expert in that space. And we have a PCI course, right? Because there's a whole brand new version of PCI coming out that has a lot to say about APIs. So we created this site. We wanted to make it as accessible as possible. So it's all free. All the courses are free. You won't see us pushing products or technologies other than, the tools that typical person is going to use, right? Postman and things like that. We do have a couple of exams now, certifications, and we do charge for those. And that's really just to cover our own costs. And it doesn't really even come close to it. But the inspiration ultimately was, there's a need out there and maybe we could help fill it. And much to our surprise, and to our sort of gratification, like, it's done incredibly well. I get to see these emails come from all around the world, people grateful for the content. And I will say, the content is exceptionally strong. We have lots of corporations now embedding our courses into their own learning management systems because they can't find anything else out there that's quite as good. So it's been a really great journey, and we're just super pleased to have been able to contribute this to the community.
That's awesome. It's really cool that you've done. I'm briefly interrupting this episode to talk about the Security Repo's sponsor, GitGuardian. GitGuardian is a code security platform that specializes in detecting secrets in your development workflows and also in your code repositories. Not only can GitGuardian bring to the surface all of those leaked secrets from way back in the history in your projects, but it can also let you know when systems have been breached by using their brand new Honey Token module. Honey Tokens are fake credentials that you can put in your environments and also in your third-party tools to know when they've been compromised. GitGuardian is free for all teams with less than 25 developers. You can sign up today at gitguardian.com. All right, back to the episode. I'm going to have to check it out myself. And for all those listeners, there's going to be links to that in the show notes. So if you want to check it out, that's where you can find the links to the API Sec University. Well, we're coming to the end of the show, and I want to be conscious of your time. You've shared a whole bunch of great knowledge. But we like to play a game with kind of all of our guests at the moment called Best and Worst. And I ask everyone, what is the best security advice that you could give someone or have been given? And what is the worst security advice that you've ever received or heard? We'll start with the best.
Start with the best. Well, I guess there's like personal cybersecurity advice that I've been given that I give. And then maybe there's an API flavor of that. But for me personally, if I'm talking to, my mom or friends and they're like, what should I do about, to stay safe? It's just a couple of things, right? Number one is use a password manager, right? Like have different passwords for every website. That is just a must do. Don't think of your own passwords. Don't add an exclamation point or, add a digit at the end for each site. So that's number one. Number two is don't use public Wi-Fi. Use your hotspot. That's a big one for me. Just don't trust anything out there. I showed up at DEF CON for the first time ever, and I know a lot of people don't even bring their phones. I showed up, I turned on my phone, and all of a sudden these things started popping up. I'm like, what is happening here, right? So it just goes to show, like, you're probably more hackable than you realize. So those are my own personal, bits of advice from a cybersecurity perspective. From an API perspective, boy, I just really tout the whole. Your UI is not part of your security stack. Don't treat it. Don't pretend like that's what it is. It's not. It's a great band-aid. It fixes a lot of problems, but as you can see, your APIs are right there in plain sight, whether you realize it or not. And so, just because you're protecting it at the front end does not mean it's protected at that middle end. Worst advice, geez. I don't know. I've personally speaking, like having a root password that you then modify. Bad advice. Don't do it. From an API perspective, I think it has to go back to authentication does not equal authorization. Just because you have passwords and credentials and you're doing all the right things from an authentication perspective does not mean you're good. And I only say that because, gosh, there's so many examples of breaches out there where they got the authentication right, but just whiffed on the authorization side. So it's low hanging fruit, but apparently we still need to remind folks about it.
Yeah. Well, look, basics in security we're still getting wrong, and even for what you say, it's like that's if there's so much complexity in security, but at the same time, there's also this. I don't want to say stupidity. I feel like that's the wrong thing, but there's so much.
It's common sense, right?
Common sense. Yeah, yeah.
So much.
Dwayne, before we hang up, I was just going to ask if you have any final notes or words or questions for Dan.
Just wanted to say thanks for being on here. There is so much overlap between API security and the rest of code security. Like knowing what you have, know you can't defend what you don't know you have. We ask people all the time, do you know where your secrets are? Do you know how many secrets you have in play at your company? And everybody's like, no. And that's the one thing I heard at API World over and over again, where like people have no idea how many APIs they even have internally,
Yep.
let alone how they're being secured or how to even think about security. So I really, really appreciate the efforts you're making out there at AppySec University and giving those talks out just to bring this uh, awareness to the world.
Yeah, it's. I appreciate you having me on the show. Really excited to be here. I appreciate that folks like you are out there helping educate. There's clearly a huge gap, and we're all out there doing our best to try to fill it. You're right about not knowing. I mean, it's a sort of classic first question of security, like how do you secure what you don't know about, right? And what I would just say, maybe last parting comment on that, is security teams tend to want to fix things with technology, and sometimes the best solution is like just go and talk, right? Like, just because you don't know what APIs you have doesn't mean the company doesn't know, right? In fact, we have a webinar coming up in a couple of weeks on that very topic, where we've got a team from Kroger. And what's interesting, like they had the same problem, like what APIs we got, right? And what they didn't do was just go out and like plug something on the network, right? These are actually like app teams, and what do? They went around and talked to all the development organizations and just learn. And maybe they didn't get the whole thing, but it's a really interesting topic, right? Because sometimes you try to solve something with one solution, but really there might even be a better way that actually not only gives you some security, but productivity, better integrations, better collaboration. So anyways, you're absolutely right. Like, it starts with having a good idea of what you got, and then starting to secure it from there.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thanks again for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and I look forward to hearing from you or seeing you again. And one final thing, just for our listeners, if they want to follow you, maybe check out where you're next presenting, or check out your blog post. What's the best way that people can kind of stay in contact or follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, number one is to sign up for one of our courses. So we've got over 60,000 users on AppySec University. It's all free, so you could sign up. Nice thing about signing up is now you're you're kind of on our list, right? So you'll hear from us. We publish our webinars there. LinkedIn's a great place to follow us. So you can follow EpiSec University there, of course, on Twitter, X. We've got we post regularly there to share everything. We just did a series on spooky Halloween movies with an API slant. So we have a lot of fun with what we're doing. And those are all great places to follow us.
Cool. And I've just noticed your shirt too. That's an API, that's an EpiSec. Yeah.
There you go. Right. This is one of a kind. I think we need a merch store.
For sure, you should. I'd rock that. All right. For real this time, Dan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it. And look forward to having you on again.
Absolutely. Anytime.